April 30th, 1937, 14:30 hours, Maxwell Field, Alabama. A leather-faced captain walked out of the headquarters building carrying a single manila envelope. The spring heat pressed down on the airfield where he'd spent years teaching young pilots how to fight and die. Inside that envelope was his discharge paperwork, forced retirement at age 43, branded with chronic bronchitis and partial deafness. But everyone knew the real reason. History loves irony, and fate was about to deliver a masterclass. Captain Claire Lee Chennault had committed an unforgivable sin. He believed fighters could kill bombers. The Army Air Corps had made its decision. The future belonged to high-altitude bombardment. The doctrine was gospel, repeated in every tactical school, every planning session, every congressional hearing. The bomber will always get through. Chennault's theories, his insistence that pursuit aircraft could intercept and destroy bomber formations, were dismissed as the ravings of a stubborn relic clinging to outdated World War I thinking. "Who is this damned fellow Chennault?" Major General Henry H. "Hap," Arnold had asked, his voice dripping with contempt. The question wasn't really a question. It was a verdict. Chennault had written it all down in 1935. The Role of Defensive Pursuit, a tactical manual detailing exactly how defending fighters could shred bomber formations using early warning systems, coordinated interception, and precision tactics. He'd run exercises, he'd built demonstration teams, he'd lectured until his voice went hoarse. They called him abrasive, a troublemaker, obsolete. Now he was walking away from the only career he'd ever wanted, his theories discarded, his reputation in ruins. The Air Corps was building its future on bombers, massive, invincible, unstoppable. Chennault's fighters were being written out of the doctrine entirely. By 1936, the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field stopped teaching fighter tactics altogether. But what the generals didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that this fired captain would return in 5 years, commanding forces that would validate every theory they'd called impossible. June 1937, Kunming, Yunnan Province, China. Chennault arrived in China 2 months after his forced retirement, hired by Madame Chiang Kai-shek to conduct a 3-month survey of the Chinese Air Force. The contract paid $1,000 per month. Good money for a farmer, which is what his civilian passport now listed as his occupation. What he found shocked him. The Chinese Air Force was being systematically annihilated by Japanese bombers that flew without fighter escorts, knowing no opposition existed. Obsolete aircraft, inadequately trained pilots, no coherent tactical doctrine, Italian advisors who awarded wings automatically to the sons of politicians, regardless of whether they could actually fly. Mercenary pilots who subsisted almost entirely on high-octane beverages. When the Japanese launched their major offensive in July 1937, Chennault watched Chinese air resistance collapse almost instantly. Peking fell, Shanghai fell, Nanking fell. The nationalist Chinese retreated to their wartime capital at Chongqing, and Chennault stayed. Because here, 5,000 miles from Maxwell Field, in a country being torn apart by invasion, no one cared about doctrine. Here, his theories could be tested. Chennault began building something the Air Corps had told him was impossible, a defensive pursuit system that could actually stop bombers. He designed what he called a vast spider net of people, radios, telephones, and telegraph lines that covered all of free China accessible to enemy aircraft. Watchers in the countryside, farmers, villagers, monks, spotted Japanese formations taking off from occupied airfields. They relayed warnings through telephone lines, radio stations, telegraph offices. The messages moved faster than the bombers themselves, giving Chennault's pilots time to climb to altitude, position themselves, and wait. It was exactly what he'd written about in the role of defensive pursuit, the manual the Air Corps had dismissed as obsolete fantasy. Then the Japanese began their terror-bombing campaign. Chengdu, Chongqing, cities reduced to rubble, civilians slaughtered by the thousands, no defense except to hide and pray. Chennault flew reconnaissance missions himself in an export Curtiss H-75, documenting Japanese tactics, studying their formations, watching how their fighters escorted, or didn't escort, their bombers. He was 53 years old in 1940 when Madame Chiang sent him back to Washington with a desperate mission. Get as many fighter planes, bombers, and transports as possible, plus all the supplies needed to maintain them and the pilots to fly them. The response from the War Department was predictable. Hap Arnold, now a major general and chief of the Air Corps, flatly rejected the request. The Navy rejected it. They had no pilots to spare for some harebrained scheme in China involving a retired officer who'd been forced out for insubordination. But Chennault had allies. The China lobby appealed directly to President Roosevelt. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau supported the plan. On December 21, 1940, they met at Morgenthau's home and hammered out the details. Roosevelt overruled the War Department. 100 Curtiss P-40B Tomahawk fighters, originally built for Britain, would be diverted to China. The Army, Navy, and Marine Corps would be ordered to release pilots for volunteer service. The American Volunteer Group was born. Arnold was furious. So was the Navy. They'd been overruled by civilians who didn't understand modern warfare, backing a washed-up captain with obsolete theories. Chennault recruited 109 pilots and 186 ground crew. Adventurers, mercenaries, men who wanted $600 per month plus $500 for every Japanese plane they destroyed. They sailed for China in summer 1941, posing as tourists, their passports hiding their true mission. The P-40 Tomahawk was considered obsolete by 1941 standards. It lacked the agility and climbing speed of the British Spitfire or the Japanese Zero. It was built for low-altitude combat, in an era when the bomber mafia insisted the future was high-altitude strategic bombardment. But Chennault saw what the doctrine writers didn't. The P-40 was rugged, heavily armed with 6 machine guns, and possessed superior diving speed. It was perfect for the tactics he'd been preaching since 1935. August 1941. Kiado Airfield, Toungoo, Burma. Every morning at the training base, Chennault stood before his pilots and delivered the same lecture, refining it, perfecting it, until every man could recite the tactics in his sleep. You can count on a higher top speed, faster dive, and superior firepower, he'd say, his voice carrying across the sweltering airfield. The Japanese fighters have a faster rate of climb, higher ceiling, and better maneuverability. They can turn on a dime and climb almost straight up. If they can get you into a turning combat, they are deadly. His pilots, former Navy, Army, and Marine aviators, had been trained in World War I dogfighting tactics. Everything they'd learned emphasized maneuverability, turning fights, climbing contests. Chennault told them to forget it all. Use your speed and diving power to make a pass, shoot, and break away, he commanded. You have the edge in that type of combat. All your advantages are brought to bear on the Japanese deficiencies. Close your range, fire, and dive away. Make every bullet count. Never try to get all the Japanese in one pass. Hit hard, break clean, and get in position for another pass. It was called boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, use superior speed and firepower to slash through enemy formations, then climb back up before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could turn to engage. Never dogfight. never turn, never give the enemy the fight they wanted. It was the exact opposite of everything these pilots had been taught. Some thought Chennault was crazy, others thought he was brilliant. All of them would soon discover he was right. The three squadrons took whimsical names: the Adam and Eves, because Eve chasing Adam was the first pursuit, the Panda Bears, and Hell's Angels. They painted shark teeth on the noses of their P-40s, copying a design from RAF Tomahawks in Egypt. The sharks grinned, menacing and unforgettable. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Chennault's training wasn't finished, but there was no more time. December 20th, 1941, 0920 hours. Kunming, Yunnan Province, China. 10 Japanese Kawasaki Ki-48 bombers lifted off from Gia-Lam Airfield near Hanoi, their twin engines droning toward Kunming. They'd bombed this city and Chongqing regularly for more than a year without opposition. The crews were confident, almost bored. Another milk run, another defenseless target. They didn't know Chennault's warning net had spotted them the moment they took off. They didn't know 2 squadrons of shark-mouthed P-40s had arrived at Kunming 2 days earlier, and they didn't know that the obsolete theories of a fired captain were about to become their nightmare. The sky was clear, the sun brutal overhead. On the ground, air raid sirens wailed across Kunming like a city screaming for help. Children ran for the shelters. Mothers held their breath. The bombers approached Kunming from the south, circling to strike from the far side of the city. Then 4 P-40s appeared at altitude, diving with terrifying speed. Engines howled like ripping thunder. The shark-toothed fighters fell out of the sun like hawks striking prey, metal shrieking as they tore into their dives. The Japanese crews panicked. They jettisoned their bombs and broke formation, trying to flee. But the P-40s were faster. More sharks appeared, ripping through the scattered bomber formation with concentrated machine gun fire. 3 bombers went down immediately. The others scattered, desperate to reach the Indochina border. One trailed smoke, its engines sputtering. It exploded before reaching safety. Later, Chinese intelligence intercepted Japanese communications. Of the 10 bombers that attacked Kunming, only 1 returned to base. The P-40S landed at Kunming. One pilot did a victory roll. On the ground, Claire Chennault, now addressed as Colonel by the Chinese, though he held no military rank, met them with his characteristic bluntness. "It was a good job, but not good enough," he said. "Next time, get them all." The mayor of Kunming and hundreds of citizens rushed to the airfield in procession, heaping honors on the American pilots. It was the first time in years their city hadn't been bombed without consequence. Japanese airmen never again attempted to bomb Kunming, while Chennault's group defended it. Back in Washington, someone at the Chinese embassy hit upon a nickname: the Flying Tigers. Time magazine published it on December 29, 1941, Blood for the Tigers, and the name stuck. Walt Disney designed an insignia, a Bengal tiger with wings leaping through a V for victory symbol. The obsolete captain was now leading America's most famous fighter unit, but the vindication had barely begun. December 23, 1941, March 8, 1942, Battle of Rangoon, Burma. While one squadron defended Kunming, Chennault rotated the others to Rangoon, where the Japanese invasion of Burma was crushing a hodgepodge of British ground forces and a handful of RAF aircraft. What followed was carnage. For 10 weeks, the Flying Tigers and RAF fought Japanese air regiments that outnumbered them 20-1. The P-40s were outclassed in maneuverability and climb rate, but Chennault's boom and zoom tactics turned those disadvantages irrelevant. The P-40S hunted from altitude, diving with devastating speed, concentrating fire from 6 machine guns into tight bursts that shredded Japanese fighters and bombers. They refused to dogfight. They refused to turn. They hit hard and climbed away, exactly as Chennault had drilled into them. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill compared the Flying Tiger's defense of Rangoon to the RAF's Battle of Britain, calling their victories comparable in character, if not in scope. RAF Air Vice Marshal Donald F. Stevenson estimated the Allies destroyed 291 Japanese aircraft in the Burma campaign. He attributed 217 of those kills to the Flying Tigers. 217 victories, flying obsolete aircraft against superior numbers, in 10 weeks, but the sheer weight of Japanese forces was overwhelming. Rangoon fell on March 8, 1942. The invaders surged northward, capturing the Burma Road railhead at Lashio and pushing deep into Chinese territory. By early May, Japanese forces had crossed the Salween River inside China. If they reached Kunming, China would fall. May 4th to 11th, 1942. Salween River Gorge, China. The retreating Chinese army had blown the suspension bridge across the Salween River Gorge, a chasm more than a mile deep carved through the Himalayas. Some Chinese forces hadn't made it across before the bridge was destroyed. They were abandoned on the western bank. Japanese forces massed for the final push. 14 air regiments, between 400 and 500 aircraft, supported the ground invasion. Chennault had 31 flyable P-40s. There were no obstacles between the Japanese and Kunming, but a broken bridge and the AVG, Chennault later wrote. If the Japanese got to Kunming, it meant the end of the war for China. The replacement P-40EEs that had arrived in March had bomb racks. For the first time, the Flying Tigers could bomb. For 4 days, Chennault threw everything he had into the mile-deep gorge. P-40S dove into the chasm with bombs and machine guns, attacking Japanese forces from the river all the way back to the Burma border. They flew continuous missions, bombing, strafing, climbing back to altitude, attacking again. Squadron leader David Lee, Tex Hill, led flight after flight into that gorge, his P-40E screaming down through anti-aircraft fire to drop bombs on Japanese supply columns packed into the narrow road. The Japanese advance stopped. By May 11th, the only military traffic along the Burma Road was moving south, Japanese forces retreating back toward Burma. China was saved. But while the Japanese retreated across the Salween, another battle was waiting, 14,000 miles away, inside the marble halls of Washington. April 7th, 1942. Washington, D.C. The War Department had a problem. The American Volunteer Group, that ragtag collection of mercenaries led by a fired captain with obsolete theories, had become the most famous American fighting unit of the war. They'd destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft. They'd saved Burma for months longer than anyone thought possible. They'd stopped the invasion of China. And they'd done it all while the regular Army Air Forces were still reeling from Pearl Harbor. General Hap Arnold, who'd dismissed Chennault as a damned fellow with crazy ideas, now had no choice. President Roosevelt loved Chennault. The press loved him. The Chinese loved him. Most importantly, he'd been right. On April 7th, 1942, Claire Chennault was recalled to active duty with the rank of major. 3 days later, he was promoted to colonel. 12 days after that, he was made brigadier general. Within a year, he commanded the 14th Air Force with the rank of major general, controlling 900 aircraft, more than Japan had in all of China. The obsolete captain was now outranking officers who'd forced him out. But the War Department wasn't done trying to suppress him. General Joseph Stilwell, the China-Burma-India theater commander, despised air power and despised Chennault even more. Colonel Clayton Bissell, who'd been Chennault's junior in the old Air Corps, was promoted to the same grades one day earlier than Chennault at each turn, ensuring Bissell would always outrank him. The pettiness was breathtaking, yet none of it mattered. Roosevelt listened to Chennault directly, inviting correspondence, seeking his advice. When Stilwell insisted, "It's the man in the trenches that will win the war," Chennault shot back, "God damn it, Stilwell, there aren't any men in the trenches." The Flying Tigers were formally absorbed into the Army Air Forces on July 4, 1942, becoming the China Air Task Force, then the 14th Air Force. They kept the shark teeth, they kept the name, and they kept winning. Lieutenant General Hiroshi Takahashi, Chief of Staff of Japan's Northern China Area Army, later testified to Chennault's impact. "I judge the operations of the 14th Air Force to have constituted between 60% and 75% of our effective opposition in China. Without the Air Force, we could have gone anywhere we wished." The theories that got Chennault fired in 1937 were now credited with holding an entire theater of war. In 1944, Marshall and Arnold finally succeeded in forcing Chennault into retirement again, this time as a two-star general. They replaced him as commander of 14th Air Force, punishing him one final time for being right when doctrine said he was wrong. On October 31, 1945, Claire Chennault retired from the Army Air Forces. When he made his farewell call in Chungking, people from the countryside mobbed his car. The driver turned off the engine. The crowd pushed the vehicle through the streets and up hills to an open square where thousands had gathered. They'd come to honor the man who'd saved them when their own government couldn't, when the British couldn't, when every military expert said it was impossible. On July 18, 1958, 9 days before his death from lung cancer, Congress promoted Chennault to the honorary rank of lieutenant general, likely the first such promotion for a retired Air Force officer. It required a special bill and a statutory waiver. Even in death, the system that had dismissed him as obsolete struggled to acknowledge what he'd proven. The story of Claire Chennault isn't really about one man's vindication, though that's dramatic enough. It's about the terrifying danger of doctrine. In the 1930s, the bomber mafia created a doctrine so powerful, so seductive, that it became gospel. "The bomber will always get through" wasn't just a theory, it was treated as physics, as unchangeable as gravity. Fighter tactics were eliminated from the curriculum. Pursuit aircraft were deprioritized. Officers who questioned the doctrine were branded as troublemakers and forced out. The doctrine was elegant. It was logical. It was supported by exercises specifically designed to prove it correct. And it was catastrophically wrong. When war came, American bombers were slaughtered in the skies over Europe until long-range fighters, using tactics descended from Chennault's theories, finally provided escort. The doctrine that dominated the 1930s cost thousands of airmen their lives in the 1940s. Chennault's crime was seeing what the tests were designed to hide, that the exercises were rigged, that the assumptions were flawed, that real combat wouldn't respect theoretical models. He insisted on verification through realistic conditions. He demanded that doctrine bend to reality, not the other way around. They called him obsolete for refusing to ignore what his eyes were telling him. But in the jungles of Burma and the gorges of China, where doctrine meant nothing and survival meant everything, Chennault's obsolete theories kept a nation alive. His boom and zoom tactics, dismissed as outdated World War I thinking, produced kill ratios of 10-to-1 against numerically superior forces flying superior aircraft. His spider's web of warning systems, called impossible by the War Department, gave his pilots the gift of time and altitude. His insistence that fighters could destroy bombers proved correct in thousands of engagements over China, Burma, and eventually Europe. The bitter irony is that Chennault wrote it all down in 1935. The role of defensive pursuit laid out exactly how to build an effective fighter defense. The manual sat in Air Corps libraries gathering dust, while the bomber mafia built a doctrine that would kill the men they were supposed to protect. In April 1937, a fired captain walked out of Maxwell Field carrying a discharge envelope. The Air Corps thought they were disposing of a troublemaker with obsolete ideas. What they were actually doing was exiling the one man who understood how the next war would be fought. And 5 years later, when that war came, they had to beg him to come back and teach them what he'd been trying to tell them all along. The Flying Tigers destroyed at least 299 Japanese aircraft in 7 months of combat, losing only 12 P-40 in air-to-air fighting. They saved China from collapse. They held the line when no one else could. They became legend. All because one stubborn man refused to accept that being called obsolete made it true. The greatest lesson of Claire Chennault isn't about fighter tactics or bomber doctrine or even vindication. It's simpler and more terrifying. The most dangerous phrase in any military is, "We've always done it this way." Because somewhere, right now, there's another Chennault, another officer with theories that contradict doctrine, another strategist seeing flaws the tests are designed to hide, another leader being dismissed as obsolete for refusing to ignore reality. The question is whether we'll listen this time, or whether we'll wait until the bombers are overhead and the bridges are burning before we admit that maybe, just maybe, the troublemaker was right all along. Because history isn't written by the obedient, it's written by the ones who refuse to sit down and shut up.